Well, good morning. I'm Richard Lawton. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Sustainable Business Council. And on behalf of NJSBC and Business for America, I'd like to welcome everyone to a conversation on a topic that's both important and timely. In this session, we'll make the business case for secure and accurate elections in New Jersey. We'll talk about why we as business leaders should care about this issue and how we can get involved. NJSBC is a state affiliate of the American Sustainable Business Council, which represents a national network of over 250,000 triple bottom line businesses that have joined together to advance market and policy solutions to help create a healthy economy that is more vibrant, sustainable, and equitable. But a healthy economy depends on a healthy democracy, a representative democracy whose voting system has a high degree of integrity and in which all citizens have an equal opportunity to cast their vote. If you're not already a member, I invite you to visit our website or contact me via email. Next slide. There are many organizations involved in this work, and I'd like to thank those who generously offered their help in making today's webinar possible. And special thanks to our cohort of presenters who bring key perspectives and deep expertise that they'll be sharing with us over the next hour. First, Sarah Bonk, the founder of Business for America, will talk about why secure elections matter to business. Next, Michael Reed, who's a legislative director for U.S. Congresswoman Bonnie Wasserman-Coleman, will talk more about federal legislation that will help in this area. Liz Howard, who's counsel for Brennan Center for Justice, will talk about best practices for secure, accurate elections, with a special focus on New Jersey, which has some unique challenges. And finally, Barbara George Johnson is the Executive Director of the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at Thomas Edison State University. Barbara will talk about the relationship between election reform and social justice. We'll also have some time at the end of the presentations for Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to click on the Q&A button that you should see at the bottom of your Zoom app screen anytime during the webinar. Just enter your question, just type it in. If you'd like to direct your question to any particular presenter, just make a note of that as well. Then at the end of the session, we'll have presenters address those questions. I'd also like to mention that Richard Idland is joining us as well. He's one of the co-founders of the American Sustainable Business Council, is now working with Business for America. So to start the conversation going, Sarah's gonna lead us off. Sarah, you ready to go?
I am ready to go. Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you to, in addition to thanking everybody else on the call, I want to thank New Jersey Sustainable Business Council for making this possible today. You know, there are 50 states where we need to talk about secure elections, and New Jersey's a big and important one, and we're really excited to be working with you on this issue today. So, like a lot of people on this call, I come from the business sector. That's why we wanted to talk to folks in the business world for the most part. But just like any citizen, being civic-minded and recognizing that sometimes our government doesn't work so well, I decided to start volunteering in that space some years ago. It was around 2012, 2013. And I started volunteering for different groups, grassroots organizations, working on money in politics and voting rights and different ideas around justice and voting and making government function better as a representative democracy, like it's supposed to. And as I was doing all this volunteer work, really pro bono consulting, I couldn't help but notice that the business voice was missing. Nobody was making the business and economic arguments for why we need a well-functioning government, and that requires a well-functioning democracy. And that's when I decided to work on this idea of Business for America. It's been an interesting journey to talk to folks from the business world and outside the business world about why business cares, because a lot of people, it's surprisingly often that the response that I get is, you know, I think the business world likes it the way it is. They like it dysfunctional. They're able to game the system. It's working for them somehow. But when you talk to people in the business world, they're concerned, like I am, about how things are going today. So when you look at really why business cares, you can break it down a couple different ways. Absolutely, there's a self-interest for folks in the business world. You know, the policies that affect them directly, whether it's healthcare, taxes, or wages, infrastructure. There's so many things that they're relying on government to do that affect their business directly. And of course, regulations that they need to comply with, and other ways that they interact with government. So there's sort of this micro level of how well-functioning government or not well-functioning government will impact your business. Beyond that, of course, you're looking at more of a macro level and looking at how it impacts the entire economy. There's a study that the Harvard Business School puts out every year on competitiveness. And in 2016 and 2017, they found that the #1 issue hindering economic competitiveness in America is the dysfunction in our government. That is pretty impactful stuff. So we need to recognize that this isn't just about self-interest, about the economy as a whole. And of course, a rising tide lifts all boats. And when the economy is not doing well, none of us are doing well. Beyond that, beyond the business argument and the economic argument, of course, folks in the business world are also citizens. We care about what is happening to our fellow citizens, what's happening in this country. And what we see right now is we spend a lot as taxpayers and we're not getting good outcomes. We see hyperpartisanship. We see a lot of rancor and toxicity in our politics. And it doesn't have to be that way. Sometimes people feel like it's hopeless. People feel like it's always been that way. And the fact of the matter is it doesn't have to be that way. There are solutions. And what we just need to do is get the political will to make those things happen, put those solutions in place. And so that's why I helped create Business for America. We launched last year, and we're still in startup mode, getting this off the ground and building a network of civic-minded business leaders across the country. And we found a base of support in New Jersey and a couple other areas, and we're starting to grow. And it's pretty exciting. When we speak to folks in the political realm, we often hear, we're really glad to have business involved. We want to hear from business leaders. We'd like more business folks involved. So there's no shortage of opportunities for us to make an impact. So the way we plan to get things done, the way we want to make things better in America, we really are about solutions and making that happen. So the point of Business for America is not to do research and think tanking and just have conversations like this. We're here to advance public policy. We want to advance solutions, including technology solutions, make that happen at the local, state, and national level, because that's what's going to take to really have a well-functioning government and democracy in this country. We're talking to individual leaders, individual business folks who can speak as themselves, but we're also looking to bring on board businesses that are willing to say, our business, as a corporation, we believe that it's in our interest to support reforms for more representative democracy. And of course, we've also been forming partnerships with a number of different business organizations like NJSBC and others that are lending their support and lending their network for us to reach out and have a bigger impact. So our current agenda, of course, and the reason we are on this call today is the Secure Elections Act. And I want to go into super detail because others are going to tell you what's in the bill and why it makes so much sense. It's kind of ridiculous that we're not there already sometimes, but hey, it's politics, so it's going to take us a little time to get there. But this is a truly bipartisan bill. Secure elections isn't, or at least it shouldn't be, a partisan issue. It should be a left-right issue. And the folks working on this have been really smart about introducing co-sponsors in left-right pairs. And we're really excited to see that. It was introduced by a Republican senator, Senator Langford of Oklahoma, in the Senate, along with Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat. And they've continued to build in these left-right pairs. It's so practical and common sense. And it's sort of the perfect bill to engage the business community, which is sometimes a little hesitant to get involved in things that are perceived as political. Right? The business community often, when they see something that impacts their business directly, of course they feel free to speak up about that. But something like how democracy is working, there's a logical leap that this is a root issue that is blocking progress on all the other issues. But that's why it's so important. So those are the remarks I wanted to start with. Thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited to hear from everybody else. I'm going to hand it back to Richard.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. Michael, are you ready? Great.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Sarah. That was for setting the tone on this. So I'm Michael Reed. I'm Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman from New Jersey's 12th District. So happy to see a lot of friends here on this call, on this webinar. But I'm here today. I was asked to present on behalf of the Congresswoman to talk about the latest updates in Washington and federally when it comes to election security. So I want to talk about a couple things briefly. I don't want to take up too much time. I know we have a lot of far more qualified experts on this line to go into some of the details. But first thing is, I think it's important to frame how we got to this point. So when it comes to election security, as far as from my perspective, Democrats and Republicans have been focusing on it from very similar, have similarly taken it seriously, but from different angles and different perspectives. Up until 2016, we saw Republicans primarily focus on election security from a standard of making sure ineligible voters did not vote, and Democrats primarily focused on election security from manipulation of voter infrastructure. And so in 2016, when we saw the Russian interference in the presidential election, it brought a lot of these questions right to the forefront, and then the potential for manipulation of the election by hostile foreign actors such as Russia was a wake-up call to a lot of people. So, which culminated, I want to say culminated, but which was reported on extensively by the Director of National Intelligence in their report in 2017. So, frankly, while this is a bipartisan issue, and in the Senate, like Sarah mentioned, there's been a great deal of bipartisan support for improving election security. On the House side, it hasn't necessarily been as consensus or bipartisan. Sarah mentioned the Secure Elections Act, which is the Senate bill. Without getting to it briefly, and on the House side, we saw the Election Security Act, which has 123 co-sponsors in the House, but all of them are Democrats. The bills are are from a significant standpoint similar. They're in some of the details and some of the funding. There's some differences, but primarily they all do the same function, which is to provide funding from the federal government to the states to improve their election security, providing money for states to upgrade their voting machines, to make sure that they have access to paper ballots, making sure that there's funding for cybersecurity initiatives, and that there's money for audits of voting so that they can ensure moving forward that all elections are done in a secure way. So I don't think that the way that the Senate is handling that bill, I think, had been a very positive direction and very optimistic for the country. On the House side, unfortunately, since the bill is solely supported by Democrats, or at least co-sponsored by Democrats, we've been having an uphill fight on this end, trying to get consideration for something like this. So even dating back to summer of 2016, Democrats on this side have been trying to ring the alarm about potential for election interference. It took 2 years for us to get a single hearing in the House Homeland Security Committee on this topic. And even that hearing only had 2 witnesses, one person from the Department of Homeland Security, one state Secretary of State from Rhode Island. I don't want to be too partisan, but ultimately I do think it's important to frame the issues. So why we're at this point is there is still a lingering sense of partisanship on what should be a very nonpartisan issue of making sure our elections are fair and secure, and that the integrity of elections is maintained. But then on the Senate side, with the Secure Elections Act, which was bound to be marked up by the House, by the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, that bill was pulled relatively at the last minute due to some concerns primarily from secretaries of state in the states about concern about unfunded mandates related to the auditing provisions. So right now where we stand is neither the Secure Elections Act or the Election Security Act, the Secure Elections Act in the Senate or the Election Securities Act, Security Act in the House, is expected to pass before the end of before Congress adjourns at the end of the year, and then of course there's this chance that one or both houses of Congress may change and leadership. So that's something which may come up. But either way, I do know that for Congressman Watson Coleman's perspective, as well as many other people on both sides of the aisle who find this to be a very important issue, that we're looking at making sure we can continue the ball rolling on this. So I'll leave it at that. I know we have a lot of other really good people on here that I'm looking forward to hearing from, and then we can come back to the question and answer. Although I do want to leave on one point that one of the current fights, in addition to passing election security legislation, is securing funding for election security that has already been appropriated. In the this past spring, we were able to secure $380 million for Help America Vote Act funding, to which states have wide latitude as to how they implement that funding, whether or not it's updating their voting machines or cybersecurity or their sort of infrastructure. Right now, we're in a fight for FY18, for FY19. We're still seeking another $380 million. Democrats are fighting for $380 million. The Trump administration has requested $0. So the contrasts on that are still stark, but I do think that there's bipartisan support for these type of initiatives. But I do think it's important that the business community, that academics, and all sorts of different people have the opportunity to weigh in. So I really appreciate you all for putting this together and having us an opportunity to speak on this. So thank you.
Great. Michael, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that context from a national level and just updating us on legislation that's happening. So thank you very much. And Liz?
Hi, good morning. Again, my name is Liz Howard. I am counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. We are a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to reform, revitalize, and when necessary, defend our system of democracy. I'm also the former Deputy Commissioner of Elections in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and worked with the commissioner and coordinated the decertification of all of the paperless voting equipment in the state in a relatively short time period, which is relevant to the discussion that we're going to have today about New Jersey. Sarah, again, thank you so much for having me. Okay, there are my slides. So we're going to focus kind of on the current situation in New Jersey right now. And we can talk about the fact that New Jersey is one of the most interesting and at the moment concerning states in the entire country. You were once really an absolute national leader in election security. Over about 10 or more years ago, you passed two important laws, one of which required your voting equipment to include a paper trail, and a separate bill which required a post-election audit of those paper ballots. However, unfortunately, in between election officials organizing against this requirement and the fact that the recession hit, these laws, specifically the law requiring a paper trail, were amended so that they are not effective and you cannot enforce them until and unless the General Assembly allocates sufficient funds for the entire state to convert to paperless voting equipment. And since you continue to use paperless voting equipment statewide, there's no paper trail to audit. So right now you are one of only 5 states that continue to use paperless voting machines statewide. And again, this is important because there's no paper trail. So in the event of any intentional or unintentional errors that might cause a change in the results, it's difficult, if not impossible, to ever detect that. Also, in essence, even though you have a law that requires a post-election audit, since you don't have paper ballots, you don't actually have a post-election audit. So how does New Jersey rack up against other states across the country? Like I said, they're one of only 5 that use the paperless DREs statewide. DREs are the direct recording electronic voting machines, the touch screens, somewhat similar to an ATM that you might be familiar with. So you are in company with Delaware, who currently has a contract to replace all of its statewide equipment shortly after the 2018 elections. Louisiana, who also has a contract to replace all of its voting equipment, to update it with new paper-based voting equipment after 2018. South Carolina, which has publicly said that they are going to work on the transition promptly after 2018. And Georgia, where the court recently came out with an opinion chastising Georgia state election officials for their failure to grapple with the big cybersecurity concerns that we face on the election security front. Also important for this organization, the court noted that continued reliance on the use of DRE machines in public elections likely results in a debasement or dilution of the weight of plaintiffs' votes. This is a big problem. And unfortunately, you know, in New Jersey, this isn't a hypothetical problem. You've already experienced the real consequences of what happens when there's a problem when these paperless voting machines. Back in June 2011, you held a primary. In Cumberland County, you use a Sequoia ABC Advantage, which is another, it's a type of paperless voting equipment, another touchscreen. So the Democratic committee member election results came out, and a gentleman named Zirkle got 9 votes, and a gentleman with the last name of Henry got 33. Well, Mr. Zirkle was very confused by these results because all of his friends who voted, and there were only 50 people who voted, said, well, we voted for you. So Mr. Zirkle was very concerned about the outcome. What happened? He went and obtained affidavits from 28 of the 50 voters in that election, all of who stated under oath that they voted for him.
Wow.
And then they went to court, because what else are you going to do? There's no way to actually audit this equipment because there's no paper trail, there's no paper record of the votes. The county and state officials were unable to clearly explain what had happened. The Superior Court Judge, David Krell, was very concerned. He said, I have my suspicions that something that happened here was improper, but again, there's no paper trail. How would you know? He said that he does not and may never know exactly what took place regarding preparations of the ballot definitions used on primary day. In essence, like what happened? How did this occur? Can it recur? This is very troubling. This same type of equipment is used across the entire state of New Jersey, except for in Salem, Sussex, and Warren counties. If there were a problem with a bigger election and or a competitive election, I can't imagine what that would do, not just to the candidates, right, but to the voters' confidence in the election system in New Jersey. In this case, the court ordered a new election, but I don't know, you know, we don't know what a court would do if they were faced with a close election. And in this environment, the reality is, as election officials, you know that people are going to allege that there has been, the results are inaccurate for some reason. And without a paper trail, it's not unreasonable for voters to question, you know, how can you confirm the accuracy of that election result? So we do have a few things that we can do right now in the 32 days prior to the election that will help improve election security in New Jersey, accepting the fact that you are going to continue to use these paperless voting machines this November in the midterms. So what we are asking everyone to do, and what we are asking all local election officials in New Jersey to do, is to have enough emergency paper ballots for 2 to 3 hours of peak voting. Emergency paper ballots are the paper ballots that's used in the polling place if the machine malfunctions or is otherwise unavailable. So not only are we concerned about hacking, but also the fact that these machines are over 10 years old. They are past the end of their expected life. It is not going to be shocking when one or more machines across New Jersey stop working. And we need election officials to have emergency paper ballots so that voting can continue on an uninterrupted basis. And this isn't, again, just a hypothetical. We had this issue just recently down in South Carolina. In Columbia, they had a somewhat unscheduled runoff election. Because it was a quick turnaround, the machines apparently weren't properly programmed. So when they started opening polling locations on election day, they were not usable. Because the election official had properly planned and had a sufficient supply of emergency paper ballots, voting was able to continue. So we can do that in New Jersey, and we need your help to encourage our state and local election officials to do so. I will say on the good side that New Jersey is one of the few states that use these paperless DREs that have a statutory minimum number of emergency paper ballots that have to be in each polling location. But I will note that that number is exceptionally low. Each polling location only has to have 30 emergency paper ballots, and we can do better, and your election officials can do better too. So for the long-term solution, it's not complicated. We need to get paper-based voting equipment in New Jersey immediately after the midterms. There are multiple organizations that have reached out to the administrative, legislative, and executive branches to raise these concerns. Right now, New Jersey, I would say, is the only state out of the 5 that continue to use paperless DREs on a statewide basis that doesn't have a clear plan to get new equipment that includes a paper trail of every vote cast. This is a concern. And as Michael noted, Congress allocated $380 million to help the states improve election security back in March of this year. New Jersey received $9.7 million from the federal government. However, they have opted to only spend $2.5 million of that on replacing their voting equipment. We estimate that statewide it's going to cost between $40 and $63.5 million to replace all of the voting equipment. I also think it's important to look at how New Jersey's spending their money compared to the other states that had paperless voting equipment, and that should be on our next slide. As you can see, this is a concern. Again, these are the 5 states that use paperless voting equipment statewide. Delaware, Louisiana, both plan to spend 100% of the funds that they receive to improve election security from the federal government on replacing their voting equipment. South Carolina is almost there. Georgia, when they submitted this paperwork, planned to spend about half of the amount of money that they received, which is roughly equivalent to what New Jersey received on new voting equipment. And to be honest, after the court decision, which just came out about 2 weeks ago, they may revise that plan. New Jersey wants to spend only 24% of that money on new voting equipment. So if what Michael said is true, and hopefully there's more money coming down the pike, there is a bill currently up by Senator Beach, who has drafted a bill that would require the state to spend at least 50% of the money that they receive from the federal government to improve election security on replacing the paperless voting equipment going forward. But of course, that depends on whether or not the states get more money and whether or not we can pass the bill at the New Jersey General Assembly. So speaking of a few legislative options, we do have some great options at the state level. One important bill is the New Jersey Election Security Act. So importantly, this requires the transition to paper-based voting equipment across the state. It's a phased-in transition over 3 to 4 years, which is not ideal, but it is better than what we have now, which is no plan at all. It also mandates a specific type of post-election audit called a risk limiting audit, which is really the gold standard. But of course, in order to conduct a risk limiting audit, you must have a paper trail. So you must have paper ballots. And third, it's going to establish the New Jersey Election Security Commission, which will be a body that's tasked with reviewing election security measures that are in place and being implemented across the state, and providing a comprehensive overview of this information to the Secretary and to the General Assembly and to other interested organizations. I do want to say that Senator Beach is a sponsor of the New Jersey Election Security Act in the Senate. He has been really great to work with. He's a former New Jersey election official, so he's very familiar with these issues. He's absolutely had an open door policy to the Brennan Center and many other organizations that really care about this issue and have a lot of concerns. And also to a similar manner, Assemblyman Mazzeo, who is the sponsor of this bill in the House. He also similarly has had an open door policy and is very concerned about this issue. Both of them are the chairs of the relevant committees. I believe in New Jersey it's called the State and Local Government Committee, through which this bill has to pass. So these are going to be important players as we move forward in an election security front in New Jersey. I also do want to mention Assemblyman Zwicker. He has also been very helpful in promoting legislation that is going to result in the transition to paper-based voting equipment. The current bill that he has sponsored would simply mandate that when localities opt to buy new equipment, that they must buy equipment that includes a paper trail. So all three of these electeds have been very helpful and will continue to be very important as we go forward in New Jersey. What are the hurdles that we are facing in New Jersey? Well, not to no one's surprise, money. Counties right now are responsible for paying for new voting equipment until and unless the state and or federal government gives them money to purchase new equipment. And this is a quote from Michael Harper, who's the former president of the New Jersey Association of Election Officials and Counties, who he said counties want to upgrade their voting technology, but they don't have the money. Some of the election officials in New Jersey don't see that it is absolutely necessary to have a paper ballot. They've taken a somewhat nuanced position, which is actually a step forward from their previous opposition to a requirement that there be any sort of paper trail of every voter's vote. So currently their line seems to be, we do need a paper trail, but we should not go back to all paper ballots. So what she is talking about here is what's called a VVPAT, a verified voting paper audit trail. So it would be kind of a spool that stays in the voting machine that is an actual paper record of each vote cast that the voter would verify when they're casting their ballot. Now, this VVPAT is absolutely better than no paper trail whatsoever. So it is a step forward. However, this type of equipment and this type of retention of a paper record makes it very difficult to do an effective, robust audit. So we, again, are promoting actual paper ballots, even though I have to admit that any sort of paper trail is better than no paper trail. Other options. We mentioned earlier that there was recent litigation in Curling in Georgia. So that case is called Curling v. Kemp. I cannot emphasize strongly enough how unhappy the court was with the state election officials in Georgia. So the court said the state of Georgia defendants had delayed in grappling with the heightened critical cybersecurity issues of our era posed for the state's dated, vulnerable voting system that provides no independent audit trail. She also noted that the election officials had buried their head in the sand. And again, right, going back to the concern about voter confidence, a wound or reasonably threatened wound to the integrity of a state's election system carries grave consequences beyond the results in any specific election, as it pierces citizens' confidence in the electoral system and the value of voting. So just a quick note about the other states which currently do not require post-election audits. The states in red do not require post-election audits. We always are debating about whether or not to include New Jersey as a red state here, because although you do technically have a law that requires a post-election audit, you can't actually conduct a post-election audit because you don't have paper ballots. So you are somewhere in the middle. Maybe we'll make you a pink on these maps one day. And we can talk about post-election audits. We can, if you've got any questions, please let me know. I'll just note that risk limiting audits are the gold standard of post-election audits, because dissimilar to the traditional audits that you might be familiar with, where you would just look at a certain percentage from a few randomly ballots in a few randomly selected precincts, a post-election audit is going to look at ballots cast in the entire election across the entire jurisdiction or the entire state. And pilots are going on across the country right now, including Virginia, Michigan, California, Ohio, and Indiana. There's no reason that New Jersey isn't on this list, except for they don't have a paper trail of votes cast, which is unfortunate. So just to wrap up, what can you do to help us out? We have a great checklist, which I think that Richard hopefully sent you. It's going to go through all of the questions that you can ask your local election official to kind of make a determination about where they are on a cybersecurity preparedness spectrum. I also think that it's important that your local election officials know that this is an issue that that concerns you, right? And that you want to know what they are doing to make your elections more secure. Another very important thing that you can do is check your voter registration status online. If you discover a problem with your voter registration status, that may be an indicator of a much bigger problem. We were just at an event with Undersecretary Krebs of the Department of Homeland Security a couple of days ago, and he reiterated there is no concern too small to report, and if you see something, say something. So if you go check your voter registration status and there is a problem, please let your local and state election officials know, and let us know as well. Volunteer as a poll worker. There is absolutely no better way to understand the issues that election officials face on a day-to-day basis and see how they manage those issues than actually being there on election day. You can also attend the pre-election logic and accuracy testing, which is where the equipment undergoes a test to make sure that when I, in New Jersey, press the touch screen that says vote for Sarah Bonk, that is actually subsequently tabulated in the results as a vote for Sarah. And of course, we encourage everyone to vote. So thank you so much to Sarah for having me, and please let me know if you have any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Liz. Sarah, what are you running for? I didn't know you were running for office. I'll vote for you.
Oh my gosh. If anything could be harder than trying to do a startup nonprofit to make democracy run better, it would be running for office. No thanks, I'm gonna pass. And
pretty full plate, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, now we have a really good national perspective, the context, a lot of good detail on what's really going on in New Jersey. So it really kind of speaks to the integrity of our voting system. But also another key aspect is just the equal access, so that every citizen's vote is, they have access and it's counted. So Barbara, would you like to go next?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Barbara George Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the John S. Watson Institute for Public Policy at Thomas Edison State University. I want to thank Richard and Sarah for putting this webinar together. And this is an exciting time and an opportunity, I think, for our country to revisit the idea of democracy. And so the John S. Watson Institute works with communities all across the state on looking at the translation of policy to the ground. So as Sarah mentioned earlier, we're not just a think tank, we're a think and do tank. We engage New Jersey's urban mayors across the state of New Jersey. We manage the New Jersey Urban Mayors Association. And as such, it enables us to participate in policy that considers everything from health policy to economic policy to the environmental issues that we face in our state and our nation, and to look at the issues of democracy. And so I'd like to go back to thanking the Brennan Center for working on election security in the state of New Jersey. I'm thrilled to hear that we are looking at elections and voting from the national perspective as we look at the Help America Vote Act. Voting is an essential part of our democracy, and this definitely speaks to the social justice and social equity issues that we're seeing in our cities and in our nation today. And so one of the things that we focus on at the Institute is how do we work with cities to ensure that we are advancing them to be sustainable, to be equitable, and to be healthy. And the way that we do that is to ensure that the persons that we identify as leaders who are working on policies and regulations and impact the day-to-day lives of our citizens are put into those offices by citizens. And at the crux of that is voting. And so without voting, there is no democracy. Without being able to have people have access to voting, equitable access to voting, there is no such thing as democracy. Because democracy, as we know, is of the people, by the people, for the people. I think we lose sight of those very basic principles, and we have to remember that and bring that back to bear when we're talking about election law, voting, access to voting. So how does voting impact our lives and our communities? Basically in every aspect. When we look at social justice is social equity. And so we are looking at voting from the aspect of how it impacts healthcare. If you don't have a person representing you in office who understands the need for access to healthcare, for access to care, even when you have conditions that are predetermined conditions, then you don't have someone who has your voice representing you in the State House, at your local municipal government, in your council, and in your House of Representatives or your Congress. We look at economic development. How does the dollars that are coming back from two states, from the federal government, how are those dollars coming into your state to allow you to do the infrastructure work that you have to do in your cities, to allow you to attract the kind of industry and businesses to your cities? How are we looking at education policy from the federal government to the state government to local government that enables you to train workers for the new industries and the new technology, or to have enough dollars in education that allows your K through 12th grade or pre-K through post-secondary education be such that it really is not just training our young people for the industries of yesterday, but training them really for the industries of tomorrow. So all of this is impacted by social justice and is impacted by voting to ensure that we have equitable opportunities to vote across the landscape. And one of the critical pieces, I think, in voting equity is the disenfranchisement issues that we're facing around the country. And so, as Michael mentioned earlier, there are a number of activities and initiatives that are that have the intention of preventing people from voting. Disenfranchisement is one of those things. And so we find that outside of Maine and Vermont, who are the only states in the union that allow voting of incarcerated individuals, other states sort of are at different points along that scale. New Jersey happens to be one of those states that allows an ex-felon or someone who has completed their term of probation, parole, and incarceration to vote. But again, for those individuals who are either being paroled or they're on probation, they're not allowed to vote in New Jersey. And so the question is, why not? And so even though New Jersey is somewhat progressive in that area, it's not progressive enough. We're looking at opportunities to ensure that these individuals have the right to vote, minimally if they are completely out of their incarcerated state. So they're no longer incarcerated, they may be on parole, they may be on probation, but they should have the option of the ability to vote, the right to vote. Why is that important when we talk about social justice? It is critical because we know that in cities in particular, there's a disproportionate number of African American and Latino males and women who have been incarcerated. And so therefore that truly impacts the voting rolls in those communities. It impacts the issues that those individuals face when they are released from their incarceration and they come back into communities. We look at the second chance options for them. If they're not able to vote and have a voice in that process, then they're not able to properly have the kind of needs that they saw when they were incarcerated, as well as what they're facing outside of incarceration addressed. And that is critical to the advancement of our cities and to the strength and structure and stability of our cities. Because a number of these individuals will come back home, they will live in those communities, they need to be able to vote in those communities, to work in those communities, to be able to have the kind of opportunities to regroup and be able to obtain skills for work and training. And so they can become productive citizens in those communities. Because the goal is not recidivism. The goal is to be able to have people serve their time, come back into communities, work in those communities, be productive citizens, and get back to business. A lot of them are coming out of incarceration, and the likelihood is that they're going to go work for small businesses. And so we want to make sure that that path from prison to reentry to a productive, working, voting citizen is possible. And that's what we look at when we're talking about social justice, social equity in communities that have been disproportionately affected by incarceration. I'm going to leave it there.
That's great. Thanks, Barbara. No, it's great. I mean, all four of you cover so many different dimensions of this issue. You know, why business should care about this, and making the point that these are not separate issues. Creating a sustainable, equitable economy and having a healthy democracy are not separate issues. They're intertwined. So that point was made. And it means acting at both the national level and the state level. So thank you. We do have a few questions. We have a little bit of time for some questions. So I'd like to ask one that came in from one of the participants or audience. Ron Rivers, this is directed toward Liz. Ron asks, your examples clearly outline a real challenge, which is great. Are paper ballots the long-term vision for improving voting security, or are they viewed as a temporary security measure while states look to businesses to imagine solutions to deepen security with the automated machines beyond paper? Then there's a follow-up question I'll ask after you respond.
Thanks, Richard. And thank you for your question. I think this is a good one, and this is getting asked by election officials and voters across the country. So right now we see paper ballots as perhaps not intuitively the answer to all of the cybersecurity concerns and the nation state threats that we're currently facing. Now, one of the things we'll hear is that cybersecurity is a path, not a destination. So I can't tell you the paper ballots are going to absolutely be the answer to all of these concerns 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, because the threat environment continues to change. But what I can tell you is that paper ballots today are an easy, simple solution that can ensure that no matter what happens on election day, or potentially what happens to the voting equipment, that we can go back and actually have a physical paper record to look at and to confirm those results.
He had a follow-up. He had a follow-up as well. Is beyond paper even possible, or is a perspective that digital voting security will never be enough?
From my perspective, you know, there are serious concerns about engaging in digital and/or online voting. There is one state that is experimenting currently with blockchain voting for certain overseas and military voters. I will say in general, the cyber security experts, national security experts, all have significant concerns about this experiment. And again, I mean, it's hard, I think, to predict exactly what's going to happen in this particular space in 30 years from now, but I feel very confident that for today, we all need paper ballots.
Yeah. We also have a question from Jonathan Cloud. Jonathan asks, what about voting by mail? Are we sure that these are being counted properly?
So voting by mail is a trend that's picking up in the Western states. So right now we have Colorado that is practically an all vote by mail state. You've got Washington, which is headed that way, Oregon, and California is also experimenting with it right now. Vote by mail has some unique challenges. You know, every state, the way that they process absentee ballots is going to be a little bit different. A lot of the states that have moved over to voting by mail use a system of signature verification and have various options for voters whose ballot is not counted initially because of concerns about the authenticity of the signature. I think that's something that we, you know, I mean, it's an area that's growing, and I think that we're learning a lot as more and more states adopt that that stance and focus on doing all vote by mail.
Great, thank you.
I wanted to add a little color to that if I could. So it's a question I hear a lot too, you know. I am on the other coast. I'm in Silicon Valley and have worked here for, gosh, I guess 16, 17 years now. And all the time people are saying like, when can I vote from my iPhone? And so, you know, to Liz's point, we're not exactly sure where technology is going to be in the future. There are people experimenting with blockchain today to see how well that will work for elections. I think there's some pilot going on in West Virginia, if I recall correctly. Really interesting stuff. But when we're talking about the situation with elections today, you know, and everybody was like, oh, we've got these neat little machines, boop, 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 and that's great. But the problem is, of course, trust. And if any of you have ever heard of the Edelman Trust Survey, they do this annually, and we've watched as trust in institutions has declined, especially government and media lately have taken a pretty big dip. And I was on a panel earlier this year about trust in institutions, and they went through the whole Edelman survey, and it's a whole number of institutions, sports and military and education, blah, 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 blah. And everybody wanted to talk about government and the media. And I was the person on the panel, like, people were saying, like, isn't it terrible that trust is so low? How do we make people trust again? And I said, I think, like, when we're looking at the elections situation and having the background in technology that I do, I think it's rational not to trust our elections currently. Like Liz was talking about, we have no way to audit it. We have no way to know for sure when these votes are true. And in some cases, when they've built in a way to true the vote, or the story that she told us about people signing affidavits that they voted, or basically under the rule of law, saying like, yes, I will say under threat of perjury, I voted for so and so. That's not a sustainable functioning system, and it's damaging to our entire society. When we don't have this foundation of trust in our elections, let alone government and all these other institutions. But this is one way we can start. We have to have a way for people to be able to look at our elections and say, with high degree of confidence, this is right, that person won. That's somewhere we need to get as a country.
We had a follow-up question from Jonathan Cloud. I'd just like to ask. Jonathan asked, wouldn't it be cheaper to move to all mail-in ballots instead of replacing all the machines? So what are the trade-offs involved in that?
Well, this is Liz. You still have to have ballot scanners, right? You still have to have the ballots and the machines to count the ballots, even if you go to an all vote by mail. You can't, for instance, vote by mail using a paperless DRE machine. So you're going to have to get new equipment one way or another. In general, and I think, again, this is where we're learning more and more, the states that are piloting this are suggesting that one of the benefits of this is the decreased cost, because you do not have to open and oversee this massive election day operation where you are using facilities across the state. You are hiring hundreds and thousands of election officials, training hundreds and thousands of election officials across the state to check in voters and to help them vote. Again, right, like that's going to be a decision for your General Assembly to make, and it's certainly not an unreasonable approach to look at and to study and to figure out if it's best for New Jersey.
Great. I have a question. One thing, Michael, you talked about this a little bit in terms of just the whole hyper-partisanship and how the House bill only has Democrats, co-sponsoring at this point. And I guess my question is, to what degree, given, if you can speak to this a little bit more, how much of it is based on the substance of these bills versus kind of a reflexive situation where if the opposing party is for something, then you have to be against it or not for it? That's what concerns me. And I think back of when I first went to Washington, D.C. as a business member of the American Sustainable Business Council. We had a meeting before we did some lobbying on Capitol Hill, met with a former congressman from New York, and he was Republican. And he said, I'm really sympathetic to what you're advocating here, but a little advice when you're meeting with some Republican lawmakers, and one in particular from Michigan, I wouldn't use the word sustainable, because like it or not, a lot of people, conservatives in particular, look at sustainability as a liberal word. So that, is some of that dynamic at play in this issue as well in terms of how we talk about it, or is it seen as primarily a democratic issue? Or Michael, can you speak to that at all? Or
Sure. No, I think that's a really good question. I do think that there's a distinction between the level of partisanship in the House versus the Senate. I think that's a traditional sense. I think that both bodies were designed with that idea in mind that the House would be more of a partisan body, and that the Senate would be a more bipartisan, deliberative body based on the rules. Nonetheless, I do think the polarization within the House when it comes to this issue is, in my opinion, alarming. Like I mentioned before, the House version, the House Election Security Act, is by and large complementary, similar in substance, similar in function to the Secure Elections Act in the Senate, which was bipartisanly introduced and has, and even with it being pulled from the committee, well, not pulled from the committee, but even with their markup being postponed, still enjoyed wide bipartisan support. I think that we've seen across the board in a whole host of issues within the House, beyond just election security, when it comes time for us to reflect on the 2016 election and the social media campaigns to undermine the election and certain other investigations of the Trump campaign, for example, or of the administration generally, what we've seen is a lack of credible attention to that on the House side and by the House Republican leadership, in contrast with a strong bipartisan attention to those issues on the Senate side. While certain sides there may be areas of sheer disagreement that may not be irreconcilable. Yeah. I think the Senate has been much more consistent and willing to carry that out than the House has. And that being said, speaking for myself and speaking for Congressman Watson Coleman, I don't think that that's a matter of simply one side versus the other. I think that if this was an issue in which the election manipulation benefited a Democrat, right. I'm confident that Congresswoman Watson Coleman, for one, and Ranking Member Benny Thompson, the Homeland Security Committee, who's the author of the House version of the bill, would be more than pleased to take it seriously, because it's not a matter of who is the benefactor of the elections. It's ultimately a matter of voter confidence and the integrity of the elections. That's the most important aspect, and that's what's being lost in the partisanship that you mentioned.
Great, thank you.
Richard, this is Barbara.
Hey, Barbara.
Can I just also interject and piggyback on Michael, that what we're finding on the community level are individuals who are interested in civic education and understanding their role as a citizen of this country and how they help to sustain the democracy of this country, because it's incredulous to think that in the United States, we are talking about the fairness of elections. We've been the leaders in going around the world ensuring that elections are done fairly and democratic in places that we're trying to push democracy. And so on the ground in communities all over the state, people are asking for a civic education, how to be more involved locally at the state and federal level, and how they start to really engage, whether that's on a volunteer level or whether it's actually running for office, because they are concerned about the democracy.
Great, thank you. Well, this hour's gone by really quickly, so we're about out of time and we're out of questions. But one thing I do want to bring up is, Liz, you mentioned a checklist, and unless I missed it, I didn't see it. So I just want to make sure that
we're going to make sure everybody receives that. Yeah. I'll be sending a follow-up email to everybody who registered for the event with a thank you and links to resources.
Yeah, great. So Sarah, do you have any final comments?
Just a couple more comments on how to get involved. Of course, Liz has a number of ways at brennancenter.org, and you'll be able to find all those election resources, but we'll make sure everybody who joined us has that link as well. From those looking at this from the business lens, we really invite them to join us at bfa.us. We do have a letter to Congress that you can sign and start get involved with what we're doing. We hope in time, depending on the timing, because it's always a little tricky with the congressional sessions and when voting is going to happen, but we'd like to visit some legislators and bring the business voice to the Hill and help make some of these changes happen. We'd like to do the same in New Jersey, for that matter. And we also offer other opportunities to help spread the word, whether it's speaking up as a business person as an op-ed or a speaking appearance and other things. We want your involvement. That's what helps make change happen. So thanks again to everybody who was on the call. All our panelists were wonderful. And thank you, Richard. I'll let you wrap it up.
Great. I just want to add my thanks to all the panelists for your time and also for all the good work you're doing in this important area. So I hope everybody has a good afternoon and enjoy your weekend. And thanks again.